In this lecture, we will be looking at local government elections, who contests, who wins, but it's important to note this is written just before the 2021 local election. So obviously any information included here doesn't reflect any changes that may or may not happen. And I would suggest if you are... So this slide has two bar charts that show the party breakdown of UK councillors in each nation, and then the second chart shows the council control by party. Northern Ireland isn't included because all councils there are no overall control. So we can see that in England, the Conservatives are the strongest party. Scotland, it's the SNP with Conservatives and Labour pretty much neck and neck, and then in Wales, it's Labour, and then obviously Northern Ireland is just completely unique. So when we talk about a party system, on the local government level, we're actually talking about 4 different party systems, one for each nation. Now, it's important to remember that Scotland and Wales last had their local elections about 5 years ago, whereas England obviously are rolling. There are some local elections every year. So this could all change, right, quite dramatically. And another important point that we'll come to later is Scotland uses a proportionate system. Wales currently uses first past the post for local elections, but there is now the option for individual councils to change to STV if they so desire, whereas in England it is first past the post. And you can kind of see how this affects different councils, right? So Scotland has 91% of councils with no overall control, largely because of the way that the voting system translates seats, it votes into seats, whereas England, uses first past post, so you do tend to get majority councils forming much more easily. Now in Wales, that's an interesting one, right? But Wales has a much greater history of independent parties and a kind of longer struggle between or a party system that is much more fragmented compared to England or Scotland, right? So Scotland, you have the SNP on a kind of roughly 50% of the vote, and then the 3 unionist parties scrapping it out. In Wales, you tend to have Labour leading, followed fairly closely by the Conservatives, and then Plaid, and then Lib Dem. So you have a kind of 4-way, almost marginal, compared to Scotland, where you have 1 dominant party and then 3 on the other side of the independence cleavage. And this all plays out differently in how councils are formed or structured. So this slide shows the national estimated vote share based on local election results. So as the House of Commons Library notes, opinion polling aside, it's difficult to get an overview of how much support political parties attract across Great Britain in the years between general elections. Now, because local elections are not held in all local authorities at the same time, it was left to academics Colin Rawlings and Michael Thrasher to overcome this problem by using the results of local elections to estimate how the major parties would have fared had these elections taken place throughout Great Britain. Now, that's not to say that if in one set of local elections Labour gets 40% of the vote, the national equivalent vote would be 40%, right? Obviously, different councils have elections at different stages. So one year you might have predominantly unitary authorities or metropolitan districts or London boroughs having elections that are concentrated in big cities and so have different demographics, whereas the next year you might have predominantly county councils or shire districts, which tend to skew older and more conservative. So it's not just a case of adding up the vote. What you need to do is take into account the demographics of the area that did hold elections and control for that. And these do tend to be quite a good measure of where public opinion is. Something you could critique in an essay or explore further by comparing it with polling if you want. And what we can see in the chart is the impact or the rise of UKIP from about 2012 to 2015, and also the decline of the Liberal Democrats from 2010 onwards, which they've not really recovered from by 2019, but they are certainly doing better. Especially since for the Liberals their local government base was pretty important, because that was seen as the first step in getting some element of constituency representation. This table is taken from the House of Commons Library, which is an excellent resource, and we can see that Labour's strength is in London boroughs and metropolitan boroughs, whilst the Conservatives do better in county and shire district councils. Now, as we can see, the county councils and shire districts are more numerous, so it's fair to say the Conservatives do have a strong local government base, stronger than you might expect if you live or grew up in more urban areas. We can also see evidence of this in the party affiliation of councillors across Great Britain. Now, you can see that it's primarily Labour which benefited from the drop in Liberal Democrat support after the coalition, rather than the Conservatives. Now, if local elections were reflective of a party's performance or people's views on local issues, we would not have expected such a sudden drop after the coalition was formed, right? So clearly, national factors are playing out here, and this is one area that you could look at if you're doing your essay on this topic. And the next slide just shows changes over time from 2005-2018 in terms of council control. Now you can use this in your essay as well if you want to contextualise or choose a specific type of council to explore. You should be able to find more up-to-date details on the House of Commons Library website. In Wales, local elections are held every 5 years across all authorities, which are all unitary authorities. And we can see that from 1999 to 2008, when obviously it was a new Labour government, Labour's share of councillors fell, but when they were back in opposition in Westminster in 2012, their seat share perked up and the Liberal Democrats fell. What, again, does this suggest? Well, it suggests that national factors are at play, right? If you are in office in Westminster, you tend to do worse on a local level than you do when you're in opposition, even controlling for other factors, right, such as demographics. In Scotland, we see an increase in performance for the Conservatives after the independence referendum, from 9% of seats to 22%, and we can also see a consequence of introducing single transferable vote as a voting system. So the first election to use this was 2007, and we see an increase in no overall control from 34% beforehand to 84%. Now, obviously, one of the arguments for PR is that it will do these type of things, right? It'll force parties to work together and to become more collegial, more collaborative. But I don't think anybody looking at Scottish politics since the independence referendum can really say Scottish politics is kinder, more collaborative, or it's just a nice area to operate in. And shows that single transferable vote or the voting system is just one factor amongst any. And if your kind of political culture is rotten, the voting system's not necessarily going to do much to change that. Northern Ireland also uses single transferable vote. Again, you can decide for yourself whether that's helping to dampen the extremes of politics in that area or not. But all councils there are in no overall control. So the Institute for Government uses council leader as a proxy. And we can see, unsurprisingly, it's broadly split between the Protestant DUP and UUP and the Republican Sinn Féin and the SDLP. That should really surprise nobody. What is interesting, though, is, well, I guess it's only interesting in the sense that you're on a local government module, is the chunk of alliance councillors that seems to be growing, and if polling is to be believed, it's growing even more, which could represent a solid middle ground in Northern Irish politics, or not, because what we also see on the Protestant side is a decrease in support for the DUP and an increase in support for the TUV, which is the True Ulster Voice, which is seen as a more extreme version of the DUP. The typical view of local government elections is summed up by Wilson and Game, who report on a Times editorial that, essentially, local government elections are a sideshow of the real business of general elections. Their usefulness is defined in relation to their ability to help us predict general election outcomes. As Lynn and Jay argue, local democracy is a farce. Most people don't even vote in local elections, and the ones who do just treat it as a popularity poll on government in Westminster. However, as Wilson and Game state, this is more a reflection on how the media and political commentary looks at local government rather than the actual importance of local elections themselves. So, on a basic level, the question is, who am I electing? Well, essentially, you elect your councillors, right, representing the particular area in which you live. If this is a surprise to anyone on this module by week 9, I would panic, to be honest. Revisit all of the recommended reading. All councils are divided into single or multi-member electoral divisions for county councils, or wards for district, borough and unitary authorities. Each return 1, 2 or 3 councillors for 4-year terms of office. You may also have the option to elect a mayor to lead your local authority, or a metro mayor to lead a combined authority. Starting with the London mayor in 2000, there are now a number of directly elected executive mayors, which we covered in last week's lecture, similarly serving 4-year terms, and metro mayors, who also serve 4-year terms. As such, local elections are local political events, and a great many voters, if not political commentators, clearly treat them as such. Far fewer actually use their votes than in parliamentary elections, but many of those doing so consistently vote differently in two types of elections. They will vote on the basis of local rather than national issues and for or against the records or personalities of particular candidates regardless of their party. The real question is, what proportion of voters are these, right? Because it seems to me, anyway, that it is the vast majority of voters do vote for the party they always have voted for, and it's only a small number of voters who will actually have A, any knowledge of what's going on a local level, and B, any knowledge of their local councillors. Although a lot more research is needed in this area. We can also see that turnout is fairly low. If a general election is held on the same day, typically, well, obviously, local election turnout increases because very, very few people are going to go and cast a ballot in a general election, but not cast a ballot for the local election at the same time. And this is shown on the graph from the BBC. Now, of course, you might say, well, if that's the case, why not always hold local elections on the same day as general elections? That would surely boost turnout. And that is probably correct. In fact, it would, right? But what you would then be doing is having these local elections taking place when people are primed to think about national issues. And so you'd make the issue of people voting along national party lines or national considerations even worse than it currently is. Regardless, one of the key problems facing local elections in the UK is of low turnout. A consequence of this is that local government and councillors are not seen as legitimate as their parliamentary representative counterparts. Local elections across Europe see lower turnout, and they are what is known as second order elections. That is, elections that are seen as second order in terms of importance. And so you have your first order, which is typically your presidential or national legislative elections, your general elections, and in second order, things like local elections, police and crime commissioner elections, European Parliament elections, and so on. Now, we see this across Europe, right? Local elections typically have lower turnout than general elections, and so this kind of challenges the argument that today's low figures in the UK or in England represent a conscious or subconscious response of electors to undermining or weakening of local councils, right? So the argument goes, if councils have more power, more people would turn out. But that doesn't explain why areas with very powerful local government units also has lower turnout than general elections. Okay. Similarly, we also are in a situation now where political parties are giving voters more choice in more seats. So it used to be the case that a lot more seats were uncontested than they are today. It used to be the case that if you did have a choice, it was typically between Labour and Conservative, but now in many urban areas at least, you typically have at least 4 choices of Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat or Green. In Liverpool, I think every ward in 2021 will have 5 parties at least, or 5 candidates at least. So it doesn't seem to be the size of the number of candidates driving turnout either. So local council elections in 1990 produced a pretty decent peak in local turnout, 46% in Birmingham, for instance, and over 50% in many districts across the country. These figures result largely from people's fury over their poll tax bills, and this kind of offers us insight into local voting behaviour, right? When there is a salient issue that people are angry about, they are more likely to turn out. This is not necessarily related to the structure of the voting system or the base powers that local government has, but rather an issue that people can galvanise around. So what is holding down local turnout? Well, voting in local elections is fairly easy. Since the introduction of individual registration, individuals are responsible for ensuring they are registered. And this is a shift away from head of household registration, where forms are filled out by the head of the household on behalf of all residents. Under this new system, the Electoral Commission estimated there was a non-registration rate of 10% of the eligible population, 50% of 17 to 24-year-olds, and private sector tenants, and 30% of BME residents. To actually vote, you don't need to show ID, you don't even need your polling card, and the right, it's protected by a secret ballot. And now you can also have postal votes, right, and proxy votes. These were introduced or these were made easier in the Representation of the People Act 2000, which allowed for postal voting on demand, right? You could have postal vote for any reason. There is some evidence that postal vote does help turnout, but this also varies by constituency. The tables show the constituencies with the highest rate of postal voting in 2015 and the constituencies with the lowest rate of postal voting in 2015. Rawlings and Thrasher note in their report that the constituencies at the top of the postal vote league table continue to reflect the importance of prior all postal vote experience in stimulating postal vote takeout. 8 of the 10 with the largest fraction of electors entitled to vote by post in the North East, and all of those in the top 20 have had some prior experience of elections where voting by post was the only method available. One example was the North East Regional Assembly referendum, where the only way to vote was by postal vote. And it turns out, like with voting as a whole, postal voting is habit forming. Once you've done it once, you're more likely to do it again. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're more likely to do it relative to going to a polling booth. It might mean that you're more likely to vote postally than not vote at all. Frequency of elections is also another area that might have a relationship with turnout. So there are different election styles for local government. All-out elections every 4 years in England, half of your council up for election every 2 years, and 1/3 elections every year with a 4th year off. The Electoral Commission, Councillors Commission, Wilson and Game all favour a uniform system, with as many votes as possible turning out on the same local election day. Voters turning out. So why? Well, it might encourage policy consistency, forward planning, and reduce the temptation of councillors to defer politically difficult decisions until after the election. If you know you've just been elected and you've got 4 years to run your council, you can plan for those 4 years. Turnout are generally at least a few percentage points higher in whole council elections as well. If you're really dissatisfied with your council's performance, you can vote the rascals out in one go. But on the other hand, all-out elections might lead to dramatic changes in political control, producing large and sudden influxes of kind of inexperienced councillors. And also, if you're standing on, say, with 2 ward colleagues, it's harder to hold an individual councillor to account because you're almost effectively standing on your record as one of 3 Labour members, say, or one of 3 Conservative members. One thing I want you to think about for next week is for the seminar, is how to increase turnout. Wilson and Game sketch out 3 ideas: reform of local taxation, the electoral system, and voting methods. So reforming local taxation to go beyond council tax, and the idea being that if through paying local taxes people felt that they had a stake in their community and could see a clear relationship between the tax they paid and the services their council provided, more people would be inclined to vote. This seems, well, perhaps it's true, but then you'd also have to explain why turnout in general elections has been declining, or until recently was declining, when it's quite clear the tax burden in the UK, right, through income tax and VAT and things like that. Then we also have electoral systems. So the argument here is that if we use a proportionate form of voting, people who live in safe seats are more likely to vote, or people who vote for minor parties are more likely to vote because they have a greater likelihood of winning. and so they would basically eliminate the idea of safe seats, which would increase turnout. And you yourself should check if this is the case between comparing Scotland to England and Wales. And then we have the method of voting. So postal voting was found to boost turnout, as mentioned earlier. And so perhaps that, alongside some elements of electronic voting, might help, but electronic voting would have its own problems around security. So these are all things that you should think about, and think about whether these are things that could be applied across local government as a whole, or if it might suit more areas or some areas better than others, e.g. rural areas, for instance, might benefit from postal voting, say, more than urban areas, because polling stations can be closer together. Or for proportional systems, well, it might be the case that if you had 6-member wards elected by STV in rural areas, those wards would be absolutely massive. So it might not be practical. So local government elections in England and Wales are conducted by first past the post. Should kind of know what they look like. Soon Welsh councils will be able to use STV if they want. It will be interesting to see which councils adopt this, because it's not really in a ruling party's or a party with a majority's interest to move to STV, so that'll be interesting to see. And then we also see for mayors, metro mayors, police and crime commissioners, the supplementary vote, where you have you rank the top 2 candidates, or your top 2 preferred candidates, and if no candidate gets over 50%, the top 2 candidates go through, and if you voted for either of those candidates, your preferences accounted for. Local elections in Scotland use STV every 5 years, as I mentioned before. STV is interesting, I think, because we can see from Glasgow in 2012 and Liverpool in 2008 the difference it can make, right? So the Conservatives got 6% of the vote and a seat, whereas the Conservatives got 8.5% of the vote in Liverpool, but didn't win a single seat. Right? Why? Well, because the Conservatives' vote was spread across the city, and that's not rewarded, whereas in Glasgow it wasn't. It's also good for parties like, say, the Scottish Greens, who got 5.5% of the vote, of the first preference vote, at least I should say, and 5 seats, whereas in Liverpool they got 6.7% of the vote and only 1 seat. Electoral reform is often presented as a panacea for local government turnout. If we gave the voters a better or more detailed way to express their preferences, they would be more likely to turn out and vote. Well, the most common local electoral system in Western Europe is the party list, not the closed, depersonalised, unalterable list system UK voters had been required to use in European parliamentary elections, but unblocked lists, open lists, enabling voters to express personal preferences for individual candidates, or where they can rank candidates within a party in the order of preference they have for them. And this means that it's the voters, not the kind of party selectorate, that determines the order in which parties fill their quota of seats. In the UK, however, the debate typically centres around the use of first past the post, STV, or additional member system. Now, the advantages of first past the post are that it maximises the chance of a decisive electoral outcome, with a single party having the full power to carry out its programme. It minimises the likelihood of protracted post-election inter-party bargaining to form minority or power-sharing administrations. It provides for a direct and personal councillor-constituent relationship, unlike some systems of PR, in which representatives may not be linked to any geographical constituency. It encourages parties to be broad-based, tolerant and moderate, and discourages the creation and proliferation of new and possibly extremist parties. It's easy to understand and it's easy to administer, and there is no alternative which has widespread agreement. On the other hand, against first past the post, well, it distorts, often grossly, the relationship between votes cast and seats won. Parties regularly win overwhelming control of councils on a bare majority or even a not just the simple plurality of votes. It can effectively eliminate opposition, providing councils on which the opposition is either non-existent or too small to be seriously effective, Liverpool being a prime example of this. It wastes more votes than any other system, with large majorities of votes often going to losing candidates or building up needlessly large winning surpluses, which means that it's not reflective of the actual true views of a community. It reduces the incentive to vote in safe seats amongst those who want the party that does win to vote, or those whose parties have no chance. It undermines the legitimacy of councillors, since many are elected on minority votes and on very small turnouts as well. So actually they gain the support of a small minority of their ward. It's electorally inefficient in terms of the use of votes cast, but also the ability to represent views. It's politically divisive, which encourages adversarial politics, with more attention being given to demolishing the opposition than fostering inter-party understanding. It doesn't prevent there being large numbers of hung or balanced councils, right? But it can make post-election negotiation and cooperation on a hung council more difficult, and it can discriminate against women and ethnic minorities by making it harder for them to be selected and thus elected. Though in fact female representation in Britain, British local government, is higher than in some countries with PR system, which shows that it might be an issue around political culture. The additional member system was also once favoured by the Local Government Association, which would have had 2/3 of councillors directly elected by first past the post as direct ward representatives, and then the remaining third chosen from open party lists of top-up members. Advantages over STV for this AMS, which is what they use in Scotland and the Welsh Assembly, are felt to be that ward sizes could be kept smaller, and if located on an authority-wide basis, such as for the London Assembly, top-up members would have the distinctive and useful role of representing the council area as a whole, so maybe taking like perhaps a Liverpool-wide approach to politics. Both would end the practice under first past the post of many of the country's most important councils, especially within London or metropolitan boroughs, never changing political control. And there's plenty of evidence that hung councils can work eminently satisfactorily and may foster a more open and democratic form of local government than typically found in majority-controlled authorities, because there are more veto players. The alternative vote, however, or AV, which we had a referendum on, and finally, the alternative vote, which the UK had a referendum on nearly 10 years ago, is a majoritarian system which, whilst it would let people express preferences and orders, it wouldn't necessarily produce the overall proportionate effects of a PR system. According to Wilson and Game, in the 2010 general election, apart from ensuring that all MPs had majority support in their constituencies, alternative vote might have actually reduced the Liberal Democrats' underrepresentation by around 25 seats, chiefly at the expense of Labour, or to put it another way, the Lib Dems would have got 25 more seats, Labour 25 fewer. That would not have made the results proportionate. In local elections, its likely impact would be fairly modest, doing relatively little to address the disproportionality between the parties' vote shares and seat shares, particularly in strong one-party areas. Over the next few slides, you'll see examples of the different voting systems, and you will also see videos that explain each voting system. So it's worth watching if you're just a bit confused about what is going on.
Supplementary voting is different to the way we vote in other elections. With supplementary voting, there are two columns on the ballot paper, one for voters to mark their first choice and one to mark a second. Voters mark one X in each column, although voters do not have to make a second choice. Voters then put their ballot paper into the ballot box, and when voting closes, all the votes are counted. The votes are then sorted for each candidate, and all the first choices are counted. and if a candidate has a majority, they are elected. If no candidate receives a majority, the top 2 candidates continue to a second round. All the other candidates are then eliminated, but not their second choice. If their second choice was for one of the remaining candidates, their votes are added. Those second choices are then added to the top 2 candidates' totals, and whichever candidate has the most votes after these second choices have been added is declared the winner. Congratulations!
You're about to vote at the council elections in Scotland. But might things be slightly different to what you expect? In this election, the voting system used is called single transferable vote. Here's the lowdown. Each council in Scotland is divided into smaller areas called wards. 3 or 4 councillors will be elected in the ward you live in. You may already know that you need to number the candidates on your ballot paper in order of your choice. But do you know how the votes are counted and how people get elected? To be elected under this voting system, a candidate must reach a set amount of votes, known as the quota. So what is the quota? The quota is calculated by dividing the total number of valid votes cast by the number of seats to be elected plus 1 seat. A 1 is then added to that result. For example, with 500 valid ballot papers and 4 seats to be filled, the quota would be 101. The votes are counted in stages. Stage 1, only first preferences are counted. Anyone who reaches the quota is elected. Stage 2, any votes received for a candidate above the quota are transferred to the next choice on each of those ballot papers. If no candidate has enough votes to reach the quota, the candidate with the lowest number of votes is eliminated. Stage 3. All of their votes are passed to the next preference on those ballot papers. This process is repeated until all seats up for election have been filled and your councillors have been elected. Got it? Great work.
So, let's have a look at the Mixed Member Proportional System, or MMP. In the MMP system, you have 2 votes. The first vote is for the party you prefer. This is the vote that largely decides the total number of seats each party will have of the 120 seats in Parliament. If 40% of us vote for the Cherry Party, it will get around 40% of all the seats in Parliament. If 10% of us vote for the Pear Party, it will get about 10% of the seats. Your second vote is to choose a person to represent your local electorate in Parliament. Under MMP, New Zealand is divided into 71 electorates. Whoever gets the most votes will become your local MP. They don't have to get more than half the votes to win. To get any seats in Parliament, a party must reach at least 5% of the party vote, or win an electorate seat. So let's see what can happen. The Cherry Party has won 25% of the party vote, which is equal to 30 seats in Parliament. These are filled, firstly, by the electorate seats they won, and the rest by MPs from its party list. The Pair Party hasn't won any electorate seats, but because it won 10% of the party vote, it's entitled to 10% of all the seats in Parliament. All come from its party list. The Banana Party only won 4% of the party vote, which is under the 5% threshold. But because they won one electorate, they are entitled to 4% of all the seats in Parliament. As its name says, MMP is a proportional system. This means there is likely to be a range of big and small parties in Parliament. Under the MMP voting system, governments are usually made up of more than one party, in coalition or with support agreements. And that's MMP.
In this blog post, I did a quite pseudo-scientific survey to look at Liverpool's local elections and how they might turn out under PR. The chart there shows basically the council makeup based on seat share under each system. And we can see that under all of them, Labour still get a majority, right? But we see in basically additional member system, closed party list and STV that you have representation for the Conservatives, increased representation for the Greens, and even say UKIP, and in some cases more representation for the Lib Dems. But that's not as much of an increase because it turns out that people are voting for the Lib Dems as a kind of non-Labour vote. And so if you give people a chance, so essentially people are voting Labour because they want to vote Labour, but they're voting Lib Dem because they don't want to vote Labour, right? So if you give people a broader range of choice and that choice is meaningful, more people are, or some people at least who vote Lib Dem are going to vote for other parties. So it's not necessarily the case that all parties, apart from the main one, will do better under PR than under first past the post, because we don't know how the dynamics will change. So that's worth watching, sorry, worth reading. I guess I would say that though, because I wrote it. So despite most of what I said earlier, there is evidence that voters treat local elections as local phenomena. Miller found in the 1980s, during a time when there was a greater level of party identification, half of his respondents claimed to be influenced in local elections by more local than national issues, and 2/5 to vote more for individual candidates than for the party. In all, 1 in 5 electors reported voting for a candidate of different parties in local and parliamentary elections, to which must be added the votes many more who supported candidates of the same party, but on the basis of different considerations, right? So it's no less valid to vote Labour in a general election and a local election for different reasons, right? You might have liked Jeremy Corbyn, but you also might like the work that your local councillor does, right? That's no less valid. That's still treating the local elections as local elections, even if you are voting for the same party you vote for nationally. In all, 1 in 5 electors reported voting for candidates of different parties in local and parliamentary elections. Wilson and Game, however, identify a bias in recent years towards the Conservatives in parliamentary elections and towards non-Conservative parties locally, with the Liberal Democrats in particular polling consistently higher locally than nationally. So what we mean there is that the Conservatives outperform, or at least do better in parliamentary election polling than they do in local elections. And the Liberal Democrats reverse this. People are more likely to vote Lib Dem in local elections, but not national elections. We can measure this through synchro elections in 1979, 97, 01, 05, 10 and 15, when Prime Ministers were forced or chose to call general elections on a day already fixed for the year's local elections. Rawlings and Thrasher found that the three major parties together took a much larger share of the overall vote at the local than at the European elections, and each independently lost a sizable number of its local votes to smaller parties. Further to this, not all second-order elections are judged equally. Aggregate level analysis suggests that voters assess the importance of electoral contests along a continuum and, in Britain in 2004 at least, treated local elections as less second order than European ones. fee fatale, national considerations played a less of a part in local elections, and there was some evidence that voters were influenced by the record of the locally incumbent party. So it appears that voting in European elections was more of an expressive character and is less instrumental than in either local or national elections. So these tables show the votes cast at local and European Parliament elections, where they had the full information, and you can see the difference that I was talking about for the previous slide. And you also see split ticket voting. So that's where you vote for a different party in one election than the other. And that's 33 English constituencies with perfect competition. Finally, tying into this topic is the idea of local campaigning working, right? If local elections were predominantly based on national considerations, then local campaigning would be irrelevant, right? It wouldn't make any difference because people would be assessing the government kind of the same way nationally, and so there'd be no role for campaigning. This is typically an overlooked area of research. During a modern period, constituency campaigns were seen as largely irrelevant to the outcome. In 1970, Kavanagh found that constituency campaigns were largely ritualistic, conducted as much for the camaraderie amongst activists than for any real expectation that they would influence the national outcome. Similar conclusions were drawn in electoral studies throughout the 80s. However, from the 87 to 92 general elections, a revisionist school has challenged this, arguing that constituency campaigns can improve electoral performance and indeed can be the difference between winning and losing. By 2003, Johnson and Patty were arguing that this is the new orthodoxy, and the effort in constituency campaigns is determined by the marginality, so the more marginal a seat, the more likely parties are to contest it. Incumbency, local MPs act as a draw for campaigners throughout the Parliament and help ensure that there are members on the ground ready to campaign when an election comes. It's much harder to do that when you don't have an MP because there's less holding the constituency party together. Local party strength is also important. So the stronger the local party, the more likely an intense campaign is. And then money, right? Constituency spending is an effective proxy measure for local campaign strength, but parties need money to do this. Local campaigns consist of sending election addresses to voters, holding meetings, delivering leaflets, putting up posters, arranging postal votes, trying to get local media coverage, arranging doorstep visits by the candidate, canvassing voters, either by telephone or in person, to identify their voting intentions, and as a consequence establish which areas of the constituency their parties support live. On polling day, getting out the vote is vital. Local campaigns typically, though, have been hamstrung or at least restricted by a decline of full-time professional agents replaced by trained volunteers. And the goal is often not just to win, but to build up the party vote by gaining support in other elections, right? So, you might campaign in a European Parliament election in order to boost your vote in an upcoming general election. And data is power, right? So nowadays canvas data can be uploaded to sophisticated central party databases, which then uses market research software to target voters directly. And telephone canvassing means you can outsource campaigning to areas where volunteers might be unused. So you can campaign via the telephone in marginal seats from the comfort of a safe seat. There's an increasing emphasis on centralised campaigns in winnable constituencies with a large amount of resources poured into them. You can identify possible Conservative voters and send them election material. You can provide grants to constituency parties with viable plans to boost campaign or party strength, and you can redirect resources to key constituencies. But all of this is more appropriate for a constituency level election. The more campaigning parties engage in overall, the more voters in general are mobilised, but parties are becoming increasingly focused in fewer and fewer battleground seats. Now this is bad for political discourse and engagement, and what we see on a national level we see in local levels as well. Analysis of constituencies where there are scores for all three parties show the combined levels of both traditional and modern modes of campaigning are associated with higher levels of turnout, whereas e-campaigning, campaigning online, has no statistically significant effect. Fisher et al. Show that despite the growth in campaigning styles that incur cost, the more traditional approaches conducted by free volunteer labour still have a greater propensity to deliver an electoral impact. So, you might have targeted adverts on Facebook that cost money, but this still needs to be combined with some in-person campaigning to really reap the benefits. A more intense constituency campaign was also associated with high levels of turnout at the 2010 general election. What is interesting is research by Trum et al. That finds no evidence that the competitiveness of the race conditions the positive effect of campaigning. So, in other words, it is not that turnout is low because a seat is safe. It's that a seat is safe, so parties don't campaign in it, so turnout is low. Trum et al. Argue that you would find, or the data supports the argument that you would find higher levels of turnout in a safe seat if that safe seat was campaigned thoroughly, just as you would in a marginal seat. 14 million people are covered by parish councils, and there are 70,000 parish councillors, compared to around 20,000 other councillors. Strikingly, despite a generally shared opinion that parish councils don't count, parish councils have powers over matters concerning the immediate local environment that people really notice and care about: open spaces, footpaths, litter, village halls, ponds, parking, shelters, signs, public events, allotments, and they also have influence over decisions imposed from larger councils, whether on planning, library closures, yellow lines, array of other matters. Much of the work of parish councils is non-party political, and many parish councils stand as independents. But there's a snag. In the May 2015 elections, only 20% of eligible parishes contested their vacancies. Why? People knew what they were, but not what they do. They don't communicate with the public effectively about their roles. They're seen as narrowly focused, perhaps because they're often filled with retirees who have the time for this type of service. The term of office of a parish councillor is 4 years, and council seats are elected en bloc through first past the post, like some other UK elections. The legislation provides that the number of elected members of a parish council shall not be less than 5. Larger parishes may be divided into parish wards, with separate elections in each ward. The timing of the election cycle is usually linked to that of the election of a district councillor for the ward in which the parish sits. Where elections to a district council are delayed or cancelled, so for example when it's abolished, with the formation of a unitary council, or a change from elections by thirds to the whole council, the term of a parish council may be extended to match the next elections to the new authority. Where there are an equal number or fewer candidates than there are vacancies, all candidates are elected unopposed and no poll is taken. Where there are fewer candidates than vacant seats, the parish council has the power to co-opt any person or persons to fill the vacancies. This power, however, can only be exercised if there is a quorum of councillors present and within 35 days of the election. If a vacancy occurs during the term of a parish council, it may be filled either by election or co-option. Elections only occur if, following the advertisement of the vacancy for 14 days, 10 electors send a written request to the returning officer. If no request is received, the parish council will be required to fill the vacancies by co-option. The nomination of qualifications required for a candidate for co-option are the same as those for election. The number of vacancies on the parish council is such that there is no longer quorum. The district council may temporarily appoint persons to bring the council up to strength in the interval prior to an election. However, the general power of competence is only available to eligible parish councils. An eligible council is one which is resolved to adopt the GPC, so the general power of competence, with at least 2/3 of its members being declared elected rather than co-opted, and the clerk must hold an appropriate qualification. However, the precept may not, so the precept on the council tax, may not be raised for purposes which only rely on the general power of competence. Such funding must be attained by other sources. So essentially, a parish council can't decide to just put on a massive increase or just any increase in council tax for something which can only be delivered using the powers of general competence. They can only charge for things that they are statutorily responsible for. Now, the point of this section is to highlight that A, parish councils are typically non-party political, B, they struggle to find people to fill the vacancies, and C, they require or rely on co-opting, which is unique for units of local government in the UK. There's also, it's worth noting, no restriction on being a member of a parish council and another tier of local government.